On a quiet street in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, where mature oak trees lined the sidewalks and well-maintained 1950s bungalows spoke of middle-class stability, the Jackson family appeared to be living the American dream. Keisha Jackson, a 38-year-old nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, and her husband Marcus Jackson, a 42-year-old high school basketball coach at Benjamin E. Mays High School, had been married for 15 years. Their modest brick home at 1247 Oak Haven Drive was always well kept, with neatly trimmed hedges and seasonal flowers brightening the front yard. Every Sunday, they attended services at New Bethel AME Church, where Marcus led the youth ministry and Keisha sang in the choir. Their neighbors often commented on how perfect they seemed, the successful professional couple who still held hands during their evening walks. But perfection, as Atlanta Police Detective James Carter would later discover, was just a carefully maintained facade. The morning of June 15, 2023, started like any other summer day in Atlanta. The air was thick with humidity, and the temperature was already climbing toward the 90-degree mark by 7 a.m. Keisha left for her early shift at the hospital, kissing Marcus goodbye as he slept. Nothing in her demeanor suggested that in less than 24 hours, their lives would explode into a nightmare that would make national headlines. The call came into Atlanta PD at 3:17 p.m. 14-year-old LaTonya Williams, trembling and crying, dialed 911 from her bedroom closet. Please help me," she whispered into the phone. "Coach Jackson, he's in my house. He won't leave. He's trying to. The dispatcher, Angela Morrison, kept LaTonya on the line while police units raced to the modest apartment complex on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, where LaTonya lived with her grandmother, Ruth Williams. Ruth worked as a lunch lady at the same high school where Marcus coached, and often had to leave LaTonya alone after school while she finished her shift. Officer Dante Thompson arrived first on the scene. Through the open front door, he heard screaming. Drawing his weapon, he entered the apartment, following the sounds to a back bedroom. What he found would haunt him for years to come. Marcus Jackson, respected coach and youth minister, was attempting to assault LaTonya Williams, one of his own player's younger sisters. His pants were undone, and the girl's shirt was torn. Only the arrival of the police had prevented something even worse from happening. LaTonya, once safe, revealed a horror story that had been unfolding for months. Marcus had been grooming her since she started attending the church's youth group, slowly building trust, offering to help with homework, bringing her small gifts. He knew her grandmother's schedule and had been visiting the apartment regularly, each time pushing boundaries a little further. He said nobody would believe me, LaTonya told Detective Carter during her interview. He said I'd hurt my grandmother if I told anyone that she'd lose her job at the school. He said it would break up the basketball team, and everyone would blame me. The news spread through Atlanta's West End community like wildfire. Marcus Jackson, arrested and charged with attempted sexual assault of a minor, was released on $50,000 bail within hours, thanks to his family's connections. He returned home to Keisha, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that LaTonya was troubled and making up stories. But Keisha wasn't listening to his excuses. She was reading through his phone, which he'd left behind during his arrest. What she found turned her stomach. Messages to multiple young girls, photos, videos. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a troubled teen's lies. This was a predator's carefully documented hunting ground. Among the messages were exchanges with other young girls from the church youth group, the basketball team's younger sisters, even students from the school. Marcus had been using his positions of authority to access vulnerable young girls for years. Keisha spent that night in silence, watching Marcus sleep beside her as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been arrested for attempting to assault a child. Her mind raced through 15 years of marriage, remembering small signs she'd dismissed, the late-night youth group meetings, the extra basketball practices, the mentoring sessions that always seemed to involve young girls from troubled backgrounds. How had she not seen it? How many girls had suffered while she praised her husband's dedication to youth ministry? How many lives had been damaged while she smiled proudly from the church pew? The next morning, June 16th, Keisha went through her normal routine. She made breakfast, eggs and grits, Marcus's favorite. She poured his coffee just the way he liked it. She kissed him goodbye as she left for work. But Keisha didn't go to work that day. Keisha drove around Atlanta for hours, her mind racing with fragments of evidence she'd discovered on Marcus's phone. The sweet messages to young girls, calling them special and mature for their age. The photos they'd been manipulated into sending. The threats when they tried to pull away. She parked outside Grady Memorial Hospital, where she'd worked for 12 years in the emergency department, treating countless victims of abuse. How many times had she held the hands of young girls, promising them the monster couldn't hurt them anymore? And all this time, she'd been sleeping next to a monster. At 2:30 p.m., Keisha made 2 stops. First at a hardware store on Memorial Drive, then at a pharmacy. Security cameras would later show her appearing calm and collected as she purchased rope, duct tape, and a set of sharp kitchen knives. At the pharmacy, she bought sleeping pills and bandages. She returned home early, around 4 p.m., knowing Marcus would be there. After his arrest, the school had placed him on administrative leave, pending investigation. She found him in his home office, deleting messages from his laptop. "Baby," he said, barely looking up. "You're home early. I was thinking we should talk to Pastor Williams about this situation. He'll know how to handle it." Keisha smiled softly. "I made your favorite sweet tea," she said, holding out a glass. "We can talk about everything." Marcus didn't notice anything unusual about the tea's slightly bitter taste. Within 30 minutes, the sleeping pills Keisha had crushed into the drink began to take effect. He dozed off in his office chair, his laptop still open to his email account, where he'd been messaging his lawyer about damage control strategies. What happened next would be pieced together later by Detective Carter and his team. That was it, through physical evidence and Keisha's own confession. She used the rope to tie Marcus to the chair, securing his arms and legs. The duct tape went across his mouth. Then she waited for the sleeping pills to wear off. When Marcus awoke an hour later, he found himself unable to move or speak. Keisha sat across from him, still in her nurse's scrubs, holding one of the new kitchen knives. "I read everything," she said quietly. "Every message, every threat, every lie. I saw the pictures you made, those girls send you. I saw what you sent back. Latonia wasn't the first, was she? How many others were there before someone finally caught you?" She stood up, moving closer. 15 years, Marcus. 15 years I defended you to everyone. When people whispered about you spending too much time with the young girls at church, I said you were being a mentor. When parents complained about your private coaching sessions, I said they were blessed to have such a dedicated coach. Marcus tried to speak through the duct tape, his eyes wide with fear. "You know what the worst part is?" Keisha continued, her voice eerily calm. "I'm a nurse. I've seen what happens to girls after men like you hurt them. I've held them while they cried. I've cleaned their wounds. I've called the police and watched them shake with fear when they had to tell their stories. And all this time, I was married to someone doing the exact same thing." What happened next would make headlines across the country. Using her medical knowledge of anatomy and her skills with a blade, Keisha performed what police reports would later clinically describe as a non-medical castration. The procedure took less than 5 minutes. Marcus's muffled screams eventually attracted the attention of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Thompson, who called 911 at 6:43 p.m. "Something's wrong at the Jacksons," she told the dispatcher. "I hear screaming, but it sounds strange, like someone's mouth is covered." When police arrived at 6:52 p.m., they found the front door unlocked. Inside, they discovered Marcus still tied to the chair, bleeding but conscious. Keisha sat in the corner of the office, the bloody knife on the floor beside her, calmly writing what appeared to be a statement. Officer Sarah Jenkins, first on the scene, would later testify about Keisha's unusual composure. She looked up when we entered, finished her sentence, and said, "I've written down everything he did. The evidence is on his laptop and phone. I'm ready to go with you now." Marcus was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, ironically, the same hospital where Keisha worked, while bleeding heavily. The severed organ was found wrapped in a kitchen towel, preserved in ice from their freezer. Despite Keisha's medical knowledge and quick preservation of the organ, doctors were unable to reattach it due to the nature of the cuts. Detective James Carter arrived at the Jackson residence at 7:30 p.m. to find a scene that would become infamous in Atlanta police history. The office where the incident occurred was immaculate, except for the bloody chair where Marcus had been restrained. Keisha had even laid down plastic sheeting before carrying out her attack, showing a level of premeditation that would later become crucial in her trial. "I've never seen anything like it," Carter would later tell his partner. 23 years on the force, and I've never seen someone so methodical in their revenge. The 12-page statement Keisha had written while waiting for police was detailed and damning. She described not only her actions, but included everything she had discovered about Marcus's predatory behavior. She provided passwords to his devices and accounts, locations of hidden files, and names of potential victims she had identified from his messages. As Carter began his investigation, the scope of Marcus Jackson's crimes began to emerge. In addition to LaTonya Williams, 7 other girls aged 13 to 15 were identified as victims of his grooming and abuse. The earliest case dated back 5 years. Interviews with the victims revealed a pattern. Marcus would target girls from troubled homes, often with single parents working multiple jobs. He used his positions as coach and youth minister to gain access, offering private basketball lessons or spiritual counseling. He bought them gifts, told them they were special, and gradually introduced sexual elements to their interactions. Destiny Robinson, now 18, was one of the first to come forward after news of Marcus's arrest broke. "He started messaging me when I was 13, she told investigators. Said I had real potential in basketball, that he could help me get a college scholarship. My mama was so proud that a respected coach was taking interest in my future." The messages on Marcus's devices showed how he manipulated his victims, using their dreams of athletic scholarships or their religious faith against them. When they tried to resist or threatened to tell someone, he would remind them of their family's need for his help or suggest that no one would believe them over a respected community leader. Meanwhile, Keisha Jackson sat in a holding cell at the Atlanta City Detention Center, refusing all visitors except her lawyer, Regina Patterson. Patterson, a prominent defense attorney known for taking high-profile cases, had initially been skeptical about taking Keisha's case. But after reading the evidence of Marcus's crimes, she agreed to represent Keisha pro bono. "This isn't just about revenge," Patterson told reporters outside the detention center. "This is about a woman who discovered her husband was systematically abusing vulnerable children, using his marriage to her as cover for his crimes. She didn't just snap, she acted to protect other potential victims." The community's reaction was mixed but largely sympathetic to Keisha. Protests formed outside the detention center, with supporters holding signs reading "Free Keisha" and "She protected our children." Local radio shows were flooded with calls supporting her actions. But it was the response from Marcus's victims and their families that proved most powerful. One by one, they came forward to tell their stories, not just to police, but to the media. Their accounts painted a picture of a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, protected by his reputation and position in the community. Ruth Williams, LaTonya's grandmother, spoke at a community meeting at New Bethel AME Church. "I trusted him," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted him with my grandbaby because he was a man of God, because his wife was such a good woman. I thank God every day that the police came when they did, and I thank Keisha for making sure he can't hurt anyone else's child." The investigation also revealed that there had been previous complaints about Marcus's behavior. 2 years earlier, a parent had reported concerns to the school principal about Marcus's inappropriate attention to her daughter. The complaint had been dismissed after Marcus produced character references from church leaders and fellow teachers. A former student teacher came forward to reveal she had witnessed Marcus alone with young girls in his office after school hours. When she reported it to the athletic director, she was told not to make waves and was later transferred to another school. By late June 2023, the case had captured national attention. Media outlets from across the country descended on Atlanta, setting up camp outside the courthouse and turning Oak Haven Drive into an impromptu news hub. The story hit every hot-button issue: sexual abuse, vigilante justice, religious hypocrisy, and the question of what constitutes justifiable revenge. Keisha was charged with aggravated assault and mayhem, facing up to 20 years in prison. Marcus, from his hospital bed, was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault of a minor, exploitation of a minor, and using a position of authority to commit sexual offenses. He faced up to life in prison if convicted on all charges. The preliminary hearing on July 1st drew hundreds of spectators. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters holding signs and wearing purple ribbons, the color associated with domestic violence awareness. Among them were several of Marcus's victims and their families. Inside the courtroom, Assistant District Attorney Michael Thompson laid out the state's case against Keisha. "While we understand the emotions involved," he told Judge Angela Harris, "we cannot condone vigilante justice. Mrs. Jackson planned and executed a premeditated assault that could have resulted in death." Regina Patterson's defense strategy was bold and unprecedented. "Your Honor," she began, "my client acted not out of revenge, but as a last resort to protect other potential victims. When she discovered the extent of her husband's crimes, she faced a choice: wait for a legal system that had already failed multiple victims, or take direct action to ensure he couldn't harm another child." The evidence Patterson presented was overwhelming. Forensic analysis of Marcus's devices had revealed over 3,000 inappropriate messages to minors, hundreds of explicit photos, and detailed accounts of his abuse. There were also messages to other predators, sharing techniques for grooming victims and avoiding detection. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a video found on Marcus's phone, filmed just 2 days before his arrest. In it, he laughed about LaTonia's assault attempt, telling an unknown correspondent that he almost had her and would try again soon. Detective Carter's testimony provided crucial context. "In my professional opinion," he stated, "Marcus Jackson was escalating. The frequency and boldness of his attacks were increasing. If he hadn't been stopped, it was only a matter of time before one of his victims ended up dead." The victim's testimony was heart-wrenching. One by one, young girls took the stand, describing how Marcus had manipulated them, threatened them, and stolen their innocence. Many broke down crying, unable to look at him as they recounted their experiences. Destiny Robinson's testimony was particularly powerful. "He told me I was special," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Said God had chosen me for something important. When he hurt me, he would pray afterward, ask God to forgive our sins. I was 13. I thought it was my fault." Marcus, wheelchair-bound and still recovering from his injuries, presented a pitiful figure in court. His defense team tried to paint him as a victim of mental illness, claiming he needed treatment rather than punishment. But the evidence against him was insurmountable. The turning point came when LaTonia Williams testified about the attempted assault that had finally exposed Marcus's crimes. Her grandmother, Ruth, held her hand as she described how Marcus had followed her home from school, knowing she would be alone. "He said it was finally time for my special blessing," LaTonia testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I tried to run, he grabbed me. He said no one would believe me over him, that he'd make sure my grandma lost her job if I told anyone. If the police hadn't come..." During a break-in proceedings, local news cameras caught a moment that would go viral. Keisha, being led back to holding, passed by LaTonia in the hallway. The girl rushed forward and hugged her, whispering "thank you" as deputies gently separated them. The medical testimony was equally damaging to Marcus's case. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had treated several of his victims at Grady Memorial, testified about the physical and psychological trauma they had suffered. She also confirmed that at least 2 victims had contracted sexually transmitted infections from their abuse. As the trial progressed through July and into August, the temperature outside the courthouse matched the heated atmosphere within. Every day, more victims came forward, their stories creating a devastating pattern of abuse that stretched back years. The prosecution's case against Keisha was technically solid. The attack was premeditated. She had purchased supplies specifically for the assault, and she had acted as judge, jury, and executioner. But public sentiment was overwhelmingly in her favor, making jury selection a complex process. On August 15, 2023, Marcus Jackson took the stand in his own defense, a decision his lawyers had advised against. His testimony would prove to be a devastating miscalculation. "I was trying to help these girls," he claimed, his voice trembling with what appeared to be practiced emotion. "They came from troubled homes. They needed guidance, spiritual leadership." But under cross-examination by ADA Thompson, Marcus's carefully constructed facade crumbled. When confronted with his text messages and photos, he became defensive and argumentative. The breaking point came when Thompson read aloud a message Marcus had sent to another predator, describing his techniques for selecting and grooming victims. "Look for the ones with single mamas," Thompson read from the message. "Working mamas don't have time to ask questions. Church girls are easiest. They already trust men of God." Marcus's response, "You're taking that out of context," drew audible gasps from the courtroom. Several jurors were seen shaking their heads in disgust. The next day, Keisha took the stand. Unlike her husband, she was composed and direct. She spoke about their 15-year marriage, her work as a nurse, and the moment she discovered the truth about the man she had loved. "I've held the hands of rape victims," she testified. "I've seen the damage men like Marcus do. When I read those messages, saw those pictures, I couldn't stop thinking about all the girls he'd hurt, all the lives he'd ruined, and I knew he wouldn't stop." Patterson asked her client, "Why didn't you just report him to the police?" Keisha's response would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "He was already out on bail for attacking Latonia. The system had failed these girls before. I'm a nurse. When someone's bleeding out, you don't wait for a committee meeting. You act." The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the importance of law and order, warning that vigilante justice would lead to chaos. No matter how justified Mrs. Jackson felt, ADA Thompson argued, she took the law into her own hands. That's not justice, that's revenge. Patterson's closing argument was brief but powerful. "The state asks you to condemn a woman who did what every parent, every decent human being, wishes they had the courage to do. She stopped a predator who was hiding behind his collar and his whistle, using God and basketball to access victims. Yes, she broke the law, but sometimes breaking an unjust peace is necessary to achieve true justice." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On August 23, 2023, they returned their verdicts. Marcus Jackson was found guilty on all counts. Judge Harris sentenced him to 125 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 75 years. "You used positions of trust to prey on the most vulnerable members of our community," she told him. "You hide behind God while serving the devil. You deserve every day of this sentence." For Keisha, the jury found a novel solution. They convicted her of aggravated assault, but recommended the absolute minimum sentence. Judge Harris, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances, sentenced her to 5 years, with all but 6 months suspended, plus 5 years of probation and mandatory counseling. The sentence sparked celebrations outside the courthouse. Ruth Williams led the crowd in a prayer of thanksgiving, while Destiny Robinson spoke to reporters about feeling finally free from Marcus's shadow. Keisha Jackson served her 6-month sentence at the Metro State Prison for Women, where she quickly became something of a legend among both inmates and staff. Many of the women there were survivors of abuse themselves, and they viewed her actions with a mix of awe and understanding. During her incarceration, Keisha received thousands of letters of support from across the country. Many were from survivors of sexual abuse, thanking her for taking action when the system had failed. Others were from parents, expressing their understanding of her desperate choice. Dr. Michelle Foster, a prominent psychologist specializing in trauma, began working with Marcus's victims, helping them process not only their abuse, but also their complicated feelings about Keisha's actions. She established a support group that met weekly at a community center near the church. "These girls are showing remarkable resilience," Dr. Foster would later write in a medical journal article about the case. What's particularly interesting is how Keisha's actions, while violent, seem to have given them a sense of closure that traditional legal proceedings often fail to provide. Latonia Williams, whose attempted assault had finally exposed Marcus's crimes, showed particular progress in her recovery. With counseling and support from her grandmother, she returned to school and joined a different basketball team. She even started a peer support group for young survivors of sexual abuse. "Coach Jackson made me feel powerless," she told her support group. "But Miss Keisha showed me that we don't have to stay victims. We can fight back. Maybe not the way she did, but we can stand up and tell our truth." The case led to significant changes at Benjamin E. Mays High School and throughout the Atlanta public school system. New protocols were implemented for monitoring staff-student interactions, and all private meetings between teachers and students now required another adult present. New Bethel AM Church also underwent a transformation. The new youth pastor, Reverend Angela Thompson, worked with child protection experts to establish strict guidelines for youth ministry. Background checks became mandatory for all volunteers, and security cameras were installed throughout the building. Marcus Jackson's case became a catalyst for discussion about predators in positions of authority. Several documentaries and news specials explored how he had used his roles as coach and youth minister to assess victims, leading to nationwide conversations about protecting vulnerable youth. During her imprisonment, Keisha used her time to write a detailed account of her experiences, which would later be published as Behind the Facade: How I Discovered and Stopped a Predator. The book became a bestseller, with proceeds going to a foundation she established to help young survivors of sexual abuse. On February 16, 2024, Keisha walked out of Metro State Prison into the bright Georgia sunshine. A crowd of supporters waited outside, including Ruth and LaTonya Williams, Destiny Robinson, and many others whose lives had been touched by her actions. "I'm not proud of what I did," she told reporters gathered outside the prison. "Violence isn't the answer, but I am proud that those girls are safe now, that they're healing, that they know someone believed them and was willing to fight for them." Keisha's nursing license was suspended for the duration of her probation, but she found a new calling. Working with her foundation, she began advocating for better protection of vulnerable youth and supporting survivors of sexual abuse. Her presentations at schools and community centers drew large crowds as she shared signs of grooming behavior and ways to report suspected abuse. Ruth Williams, who had initially struggled with her role in the events, having unknowingly left her granddaughter vulnerable to Marcus's attacks, found purpose in working with Keisha's foundation. Together, they developed a program to educate working parents about protecting their children when they can't be present. "We can't change what happened," Ruth often said at their presentations, "but we can change what happens next. We can learn from our pain and use it to protect others."